Well, we are in our third sermon in our series entitled Preaching Through the Centuries, Great Sermons That Stir the Heart. And last week, we moved across the Atlantic from Spurgeon in our first week to D.L. Moody in America last week. And this week we stay in America, but we go back another 100 years to the early part of the 18th century, and as we come to the sermon of Jonathan Edwards. Edwards was born October 5th, 1703. He died March 22nd, 1758. He was an American pastor, theologian, philosopher, missionary, and the third president of the College of New Jersey, which is now known as Princeton University. He was born in East Windsor, Connecticut, to the Reverend Timothy and Esther Edwards, and he was the only son out of 12 children. In 1716, when he was only 13, he entered Yale University and graduated 4 years later as valedictorian, and 3 years later earned his master's degree. In 1727, he was ordained minister at the church in Northampton, Massachusetts, where he served as the student pastor under his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard. In that same year, he married Sarah Pierpont, the daughter of James Pierpont, the founder of Yale University. Solomon Stoddard, Edwards' grandfather, died in 1729, leaving Edwards the difficult task of being the sole pastor of the largest and wealthiest congregation in the colonies. Throughout his time in Northampton, his preaching brought remarkable religious revivals. Edwards was a key figure to what has become called the First Great Awakening. However, tensions grew between Edwards and the congregation at Northampton, as he held that one needed to be a believer to participate in communion, while the church saw that communion was a converting ordinance, and this led to his dismissal from the church in 1750. From this point, he moved to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, which at the time was still a frontier settlement, and he served there as the pastor of a small congregation, and he did mission work with American Indians. In early 1958, Edwards was elected as the president of Princeton. However, shortly after taking the position, he died while undergoing an experimental inoculation for smallpox. Edwards, even today, stands as one of America's most important theologians and philosopher, and is acknowledged as being one of its greatest intellectuals. Edwards is oftentimes associated with, or most associated with, the First Great Awakening, being one of the most powerful voices for the gospel and captivating people with his sermons, especially that of sinners in the hands of an angry God. While Edwards preached much about the wrath and the judgment of God, as well as the reality and the torment of hell and the desperate need for the gospel, he also spent much time speaking to the world to come and the glorious reality of heaven and the marks of a true Christian as seen in his writings on his own resolutions. And so, it is with great privilege this morning to re-preach a sermon that was first delivered on September 1733 by Jonathan Edwards entitled The Christian Pilgrim, The True Christian's Life, A Journey Towards Heaven. Let us read Hebrews chapter 11, verses 13 and verse 14. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them, greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who seek thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. The main subject of our message this morning is that this life ought to be so spent by us as to be only a journey towards heaven. The apostle in this passage here is setting forth the excellencies of the grace of faith by the glorious effects and happy issue of it in the saints of the Old Testament. He had spoken in the preceding part of the chapter, particularly of Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, and Sarah, Isaac, and Jacob. Having enumerated those instances, he takes notice that these all died in faith, not having received the promise, but having seen them afar off, were persuaded of them and embraced them and confessed that they were strangers. In these words, the apostle seems to have a more particular respect for Abraham and Sarah and for their kindred, who came with them from Haran and from Ur of the Chaldees, as appears by the 15th verse, where the apostle states, "And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned." And so two things here may be observed. What these saints confessed of themselves, that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Thus we have a particular account concerning Abraham when in Genesis 23 verse 4 he says, "I am a stranger and a sojourner with you." And it seems to have been the general sense of the patriarchs by what Jacob says to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have the days of years of my life been, and have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage." Secondly, the inference that the apostle draws from hence that they sought another country as their home, for they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. In confessing that they were strangers, they plainly declared that this is not their country, that this is not the place where they are at home. And in confessing themselves to be pilgrims, they declared plainly that this is not their settled abode, but that they have respect for some other country which they seek and to which they are traveling. And so for the remainder of our time this morning, let us consider 4 points. First, that this life ought to be so spent by us as to be only a journey or a pilgrimage toward heaven. And here I would like to observe 6 thoughts. First, that we ought not to rest in the world and its enjoyments, but we should desire heaven. We should seek first the kingdom of God. We ought to, above all things, to desire a heavenly happiness, to be with God and to dwell with Jesus Christ. Though surrounded with the outward enjoyments and settled in families with desirable friends and relations, though we have companions whose society is delightful, and children in whom we see many promising qualifications, though we live by good neighbors and are generally beloved where known, we ought not to take our rest in these things as our portion. We should be so far from resting in them that we should desire to leave them all in God's due time. We ought to possess, to enjoy, and use them with no other view but readily to quit them whenever we are called to, and to change them willingly and cheerfully for heaven. A traveler is not wont to rest in what he meets with, however comfortable and pleasing on the road. If he passes through pleasant places, flowery meadows, or shady groves, he does not take up his content in these things, but only takes a transient view of them as he goes along. He is not enticed by fine appearances to put off the thought of proceeding, but his journey's end is in mind. If he meets with comfortable accommodations at an inn, he entertains no thought of settling there. He considers that these things are not his own, that he is a stranger, and when he has refreshed himself or tarried for a night, he is for going forward. And it is pleasant to him to think that so much of the way is already gone. So should we desire heaven more than the comforts and enjoyments of this life? The apostle mentions it as an encouraging, comfortable, and consideration to Christians that they draw near in their happiness. Now is our salvation nearer than when we first believed. Our hearts ought to be loose to these things, as that of a man on a journey, that we may cheerfully part with them whenever God calls. As it is written in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, "But this I say, brethren, the time is short. It remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they had none, and they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoice not, and they that buy as though they possess not, and they that use this world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passeth away." These things of this life are only lent to us for a little while, to serve a present turn. But we should set our hearts on heaven as our inheritance forever. Secondly, we ought to seek heaven by traveling in the way that leads thither. This is the way of holiness. We should choose and desire to travel in this way and in no other, and part with all those carnal appetites which, as weights, will tend to hinder us. The author of Hebrew makes mention of this in chapter 12, verse 1. Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race set before us. However pleasant the gratification of any appetite may be, we must lay it aside if it be a hindrance or a stumbling block in the way to heaven. We should travel on in the way of obedience to all God's commands, even the difficult as well as the easy, denying all of our sinful inclinations and interest. The way of heaven is ascending. We must be content in traveling up the hill, though it be hard and tiresome and contrary to the natural bliss of our flesh. We should follow Christ, for the path He traveled was the right way to heaven. We should take up our cross, and we should follow Him in meekness and lowliness of heart, obedience and charity and diligence to do good and patience under all afflictions. The way to heaven is a heavenly life. It is an imitation of those who are in heaven in their holy enjoyments, loving, adoring, serving, and praising God and the Lamb. And even if we could go to heaven with the gratification of our lust, we should prefer a way of holiness and conformity to the spiritual, self-denying rules of the gospel. Thirdly, we should travel on this way in a laborious manner. Long journeys are attended with toil and fatigue, especially if through a wilderness, and such persons in this case expect no other than to suffer hardship and weariness. So we should travel in this way of holiness, improving our time and strength to surmount the difficulties and the obstacles that are in the way. The land that we have to travel through is a wilderness, for there are many mountains, rocks, and rough places that we must go over, and therefore there is a necessity that we should lay out our strength. Fourthly, our whole lives ought to be spent in traveling this road. We ought to begin early. This should be our first concern when persons become capable of acting. When they first set out in the world, they should set out on this journey. And we ought to travel on with persistence. It ought to be our work every day. We should often think of our journey's end and make it our daily work to travel on in the way that leads to it. He who is on a journey is often thinking of the destined place. And it is his daily care and business to get along and to improve his time to get towards his journey's end. Thus, should heaven be continually in our thoughts, and the immediate entrance or passage to it, that of death, should be ever present with us. We ought to persevere in this way as long as we live. And again, as it says in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, let us run with patience the race that is set before us. Though the road be difficult and toilsome, we must hold out with patience and be content to endure hardships. Though the journey be long, yet we must not stop short, but hold on till we arrive at the place that we seek. Nor should we be discouraged with the length and the difficulties of the way, as the children of Israel were, and were for being to turn back again. All our thoughts and our designs should be to press forward till we arrive. Fifth, we ought to be continually growing in holiness, and in that respect, coming nearer and nearer to heaven. We should be endeavoring to come nearer to heaven, in being more heavenly, becoming more and more like the inhabitants of heaven in respect to holiness and conformity to God, and having a better knowledge of God and of Christ, and having clearer views of the glory of God and the beauty of Christ and the excellency of divine things as we come nearer to the blissful vision. We should labor to be continually growing in divine love, that this may be increasing flame in our hearts, till they ascend wholly in this flame in obedience and a heavenly conversation, that we may do the will of God on earth as the angels do in heaven, in comfort and spiritual joy and in sensible communion with God and with Jesus Christ. Our path as Christians, as pilgrims, should be, as Proverbs 4 verse 18 states, the shining light that shines more and more to the perfect day. We ought to be hungering and thirsting after righteousness, after an increase in righteousness, as newborn babes desire the sincere milk of the word, that ye may grow thereby. The perfection of heaven, it should be our mark. As the apostle writes, this one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind, and reaching forth unto those things that are before. I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. 6, all other concerns of life ought to be entirely subordinate to this. When a man is on a journey, all the steps he takes are subordinated to the aim of getting to his journey's end. And if he carries money or provisions with him, it is to supply him in his journey. So we ought to wholly subordinate all other business and all other temporal enjoyments to the affair of traveling to heaven. When anything we have becomes a clog and a hindrance to us, we should quit it immediately. The use of our worldly enjoyments and possessions should be with such a view and in such a manner as to further us in our way heavenward. Thus we should eat, we should drink and clothe ourselves and improve the conversation and enjoyment of friends. And whatever business we are setting about, whatever design we are engaging, we should inquire with ourselves whether this business or undertaking will forward us in our way to heaven. And if not, we should and we must quit our design. The second point is that we must consider why the Christian life is a journey and a pilgrimage. And here we have 4 thoughts to consider. First, that this world is not our abiding place. Our continuance here is but very short. Man's days on the earth are as a shadow. It was never designed by God that this world should be our home. Neither did God give us these temporal accommodations for that end. If God had given us ample estates and children or other pleasant friends, it is with no such design that we should be furnished here as for our settled abode, but with a design that we should use them for the present and then leave them in a very little time. When we are called to any secular business or charged with the care of a family, and if we improve our lives or other purpose than as a journey toward heaven, then all of our labor is lost. If we spend our lives in the pursuit of temporal happiness, as riches or sensual pleasures, credit and the esteem of men, delight in our children and the prospect of seeing them well brought up and well settled, all of these things will be of little significancy to us. You see, death will blow up our hopes, and it will put an end to these enjoyments. The places that have known us will know us no more, and the eye that has seen us shall see us no more. We must be taken away forever from these things, and it is uncertain when. It may be soon after we are put into possession of them. And then, where will be all our worldly employments and enjoyments when we are laid in the silent grave? As it says in Job chapter 14, verse 12, so man lieth down and riseth not again till the heavens be no more. Secondly, the future world was designed to be our settled and our everlasting abode. There it was intended that we should be fixed, and there alone is a lasting habitation and a lasting inheritance. The present state is short and transitory, but our state in the other world is everlasting. And as we are there at first, so we must be without change. Our state in the future world, therefore, being eternal, is of so much greater importance than our state here, that all our concerns in this world should be wholly subordinated to it. Thirdly, heaven is that place alone where our highest end and our highest good is to be obtained. God had made us for himself, for it says, of him and through him and to him are all things. Therefore, then do we attain our highest end when we are brought to God. That is by being brought to heaven, for that is God's throne, the place of his special presence. There is but a very imperfect union with God to be had in this world. A very imperfect knowledge of him in the midst of much darkness. A very imperfect conformity to God mingled with the abundance of estrangement. Here we can serve and glorify God, but in a very imperfect manner. Our service here is mingled with sin, which dishonors God. But when we get to heaven, we shall be brought to the perfect union with God and have a more clear view of him. There we shall be fully conformed to God without any remaining sin, for we shall see him as he is. There we shall serve God perfectly and glorify him in an exalted manner, even to the utmost of the powers and the capacity of our nature. Then we shall perfectly give ourselves to God. Our hearts will be pure and holy offerings presented in a flame of divine love. God is the highest good of the reasonable creature, and the enjoyment of him is the only happiness with which our souls can be satisfied. To go to heaven, fully to enjoy God, is infinitely better than the most pleasant accommodations here. Fathers, mothers, husbands, wives, and children, or the company of earthly friends are but shadows, but the enjoyment of God is the substance. These former things are but scattered beams, but God, he is the sun. These things are but streams, but God is the fountain. These are but drops, but God is the ocean. Therefore, it becomes us to spend this life only as a journey towards heaven, as it becomes us to make the seeking of our highest end and proper good the whole work of our lives, to which we should subordinate all other concerns of life. Why should we labor for or set our hearts on anything else but that which is our proper end and our true happiness? For our present state and all that belongs to it is designed by him that made all things to be holy in order to another world. This world was made as a place for preparation for another. Man's mortal life was given him that he might be prepared for his fixed state. And all that God has given is given for this purpose. It says that the sun shines, the rain falls upon us, and the earth yields her increase to us for this end. Civil, ecclesiastical, and family affairs, and all our personal concerns are designed and ordered in subordination to the future world by the Maker and the Disposer of all things. To this, therefore, they ought to be subordinated by us. Thirdly, as we have considered the instruction that life is a journey or a pilgrimage, it should bring us to realize that this journey or pilgrimage is towards heaven. When persons are converted, they do but begin their work and set out in the way they have to go. They never till then do anything at that work in which their whole lives ought to be spent. Persons before conversion never take a step that way. Then does a man first set out on his journey when he is brought home to Christ. And so far is he from having done his work that his care and labor in his Christian work and business is then but begun, in which he must spend the remaining part of his life. Those persons do ill, who when they are converted and have obtained a hope of their being in good condition, do not strive as earnestly as they did before while they were under awakenings. They ought henceforth, as long as they live, to be in earnest and laborious, as watchful and careful as ever. Yea, they should increase more and more. It is no just excuse that now they have obtained conversion, should not we be as diligent, serve and glorify our God? And if we have obtained grace, yet we ought to strive as much that we may obtain the other degrees that are before. The apostle tells us that he forgot what was behind and reached forth towards that which was before. Yea, those who are converted now have a further reason to strive for grace, for they have seen something of its excellency. A man who has once tasted the blessings of Canaan has more reason to press forward than he had before. And they who are converted should strive to make their calling and election sure. All those who are converted, seeking and serving God with the utmost diligence, is the way to have assurance and to have it maintained. Secondly, this doctrine may teach us moderation in our mourning for the loss of such dear friends who, while they lived, improved their lives to right purposes. If they lived a holy life, then their lives were a journey towards heaven. And why should we be immoderate in mourning when they have got to their journey's end? Death, though it appears to us with a frightful aspect, is to them a great blessing, and their end is happy and better than their beginning. As it states in Ecclesiastes 7 verse 1, the day of their death is better than the day of their birth. While they lived, they desired heaven, and they chose it above this world and any of its enjoyments. For this they earnestly longed, and why should we grieve that they have obtained it? Now they have got to their Father's house. They find more comfort 1,000 times now that they are gone home than they did in their journey. In this world, they underwent much labor and toil. It was a wilderness that they passed through. There were many difficulties in the way, mountains and rough places. It was laborious and a fatiguing travel up this road. And they had many wearisome days and nights, but now they have got to their everlasting rest. As the Apostle John records, and I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, Write, Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord, for henceforth, yea, saith the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them. They look back upon the difficulties and the sorrows and the dangers of life, and yet they rejoice that they have surmounted them all. We are ready to look upon their death as calamity, and to mourn that those who were so dear to us should be in a dark grave, that they are transformed to corruption and worms, taken away from their dear children and enjoyments as though they were in an awful circumstance. But this is owing to our infirmity, for they are in a happy condition, inconceivably blessed. They do not mourn, but they rejoice with exceeding joy. Their mouths are filled with joyful song, and they drink at the rivers of pleasure. They find no mixture of grief, that they have changed their earthly enjoyments and the company of mortals for the company of heaven. Their life here, though in the best of circumstances, was attended with much that was adverse and afflictive. But now there is an end to all adversity, for they shall hunger no more, nor shall there be any thirst, neither shall the sun light on them, or any heat. For the Lamb which is in the midst of the throne shall feed them, and shall lead them unto living waters, and shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. It is true that we shall see them no more in this world. Yet we ought to consider that we are traveling towards this same place, and why should we break our hearts that they have got there before us? We are following after them, and hope as soon as we have got to our journey's end to be with them in much better circumstances. A degree of mourning for near relations when departed is not inconsistent with Christianity, but is very agreeable to it. For as long as we are flesh and blood, we have natural propensities and affections, but we have just reason that our mourning should be mixed with joy. As it says in 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 14, "But I would not have you be ignorant, brethren, concerning them that are asleep, that ye sorrow not, even as others that have no hope." The apostle is saying here that they should not sorrow as the heathen who had no knowledge of future happiness. And this appears by the following verse. "For if we believe that Jesus died and he rose again, even so them also which sleep in Jesus God will bring with him." Thirdly, if our lives ought to be only a journey toward heaven, how ill do they improve their lives that spend it traveling towards hell. Some men spend their whole lives from their infancy to their dying day in going down the broad way to destruction. They not only draw nearer to hell as time, but they every day grow more ripe for destruction. And they are more assimilated to the inhabitants of the eternal world. While others press forward in the straight and narrow way to life and laboriously travel up the hill towards Zion against the inclinations and the tendencies of the flesh, these run with a swift career down to eternal death. This is their employment every day with all wicked men, and the whole day is spent in it. As soon as ever they awake in the morning, they set out anew in the way to hell and spend every waking moment in it. They begin in early days, as the psalmist says, "The wicked are estranged from the womb." They go astray as soon as they are born, speaking lies. They hold on to it with perseverance. Many of them who live to be old are never weary in it. Though they live to be 100 years old, they will not cease traveling in the way to hell until they arrive there. And all the concerns of life are subordinate to this employment. A wicked man is a servant of sin, and his powers and faculties are employed in the service of sin and in the fitness for hell. And all his possessions are so used by him as to be subservient in the same purpose. Men spend their time in treasuring up wrath against the day of wrath. Thus do all clean persons who live in lewd practices, all malicious persons who all profane persons who neglect the duties of religion. Thus do all unjust persons and those who are fraudulent and oppressive in their dealings. Thus do all backbiters and revelers and all covetous persons that have set their hearts chiefly on the riches of this world. Thus do all tavern haunters and frequenters of ill company and many other kinds that might be mentioned. Thus the bulk of mankind are hastening onward in the broad way to destruction, which is, as it were, filled up with the multitudes that are going in with one accord. And they are every day going to hell out of this broad way by the thousands. Multitudes are continually flowing down into the great lake of fire in brimstone as some mighty river constantly disembogues its water into the ocean. Our fourth point is that we have an exhortation to spend the present life that it may only be a journey towards heaven. We must labor to obtain such a disposition of mind that you may choose heaven for your inheritance and home, and may earnestly long for it, and be willing to change this world and all its enjoyments for heaven. Labor to have your hearts taken up with so much about heaven and heavenly enjoyments as that you may rejoice when God calls you to leave your best earthly friends and comforts for heaven, there to eternally enjoy God and Christ. Be persuaded to travel in the way that leads to heaven, in holiness, self-denial, mortification, obedience to all the commands of God, following Christ's example, and in the way of a heavenly life or an imitation of the saints and the angels in heaven. Let it be your daily work from morning until night, and hold out in it to the end. Let nothing stop or discourage you, or turn you aside from this road, and let all other concerns be subordinated to this. Consider the reasons that we have mentioned, why you should thus spend your life. That this world is not your abiding place, that the future world is to be your everlasting abode, and that the enjoyments and concerns of this world are given entirely in order to another. With this, there are 5 thoughts to consider. First, how worthy is heaven that your life should be wholly spent as a journey towards it? To what better purpose can you spend your life? What better end can you propose to your journey than to obtain heaven? You are placed in this world with a choice given you, that you may travel which way you please, and one way leads to heaven. Now, how can you direct your course better than this way? All men have some aim or other in living. Some mainly seek worldly things. They spend their days in such pursuits. But is not heaven, where there is fullness of joy forever, much more worthy to be sought by you? How can you better employ your strength, use your means, and spend your days than in traveling the road that leads to the everlasting enjoyment of God, to His glorious presence, to the new Jerusalem, to the heavenly Mount Zion, where all your desires will be filled and no danger of ever losing your happiness? No man is at home in this world, whether he choose heaven or not. Here he is but a transient person. So where will you choose your home? Better than in heaven. Secondly, this is the way to have death comfortable for us, to spend our lives so as to be only journeying towards heaven, is a way to be free from bondage and to have the prospect and forethought of death comfortable. Does the traveler think of his journey's end with terror and fear? Is it terrible to him to think that he has almost got to his journey's end? Were the children of Israel sorry after 40 years' travel in the wilderness when they had almost got to Canaan? This is the way to be able to part with this world without any grief. Does it grieve the traveler when he has got home, to quit his staff and the load of his provisions that has sustained him on his way? Thirdly, no more of your life will be pleasant to you of when you come to die than has been spent after this manner. If you have spent none of your life this way, your whole life will be terrible to you to think of it. You will see then that all of your life has been spent otherwise is nothing but lost. You will see then the vanity of all other aims that you may have proposed to yourself. The thoughts of what you were here possessed and enjoyed will not be pleasant to you, unless you can think also that you have subordinated them to this purpose of heaven. Fourthly, consider that those who are willing thus to spend their lives as a journey towards heaven may have heaven. Heaven, however high and glorious, is attainable to such poor, worthless creatures as we are. We may obtain that glorious region, which is the habitation of angels. Yea, it is the dwelling place of the Son of God, and where is the glorious presence of the great Jehovah. And not only that, we may have it freely, without any money and without any price. if we are but willing to travel the road that leads to it and bend our course that way as long as we live, we may and shall have heaven for our eternal resting place. Fifth, let it be considered that if our lives be not a journey toward heaven, they will be a journey towards hell. All mankind, after they have been here a short while, go to either of the two great receptacles of all that depart out of this world. One being heaven in the eternal presence of God, and the other, whither the bulk of mankind throng, into eternal punishment in hell. And one or the other of these must be the issue of the course in this world. I shall conclude by giving a few directions or application. First, labor to get a sense of the vanity of this world on account of the little satisfaction that is to be enjoyed here, its short continuance, and unserviceableness when we most stand in need of help when we are on the deathbed. All men that live any considerable time in the world might see enough to convince them of its vanity if they would but consider. Be persuaded, therefore, to exercise consideration when you see or hear from time to time of the death of others. Labor then to turn your thoughts this way and to see the vanity of the world in such a glass. Secondly, labor to be much acquainted with heaven. If you are not acquainted with it, you will not be likely to spend your life as a journey towards it. You will not be sensible of its worth, nor will you long for it. Unless you are much conversant in your mind with a better good, it will be exceeding difficult to you to have your hearts loose from these things, to use them only in subordination to something else, and be ready to part with them for the sake of that better good. Labor, therefore, to obtain a realizing sense of the heavenly world, to get a firm belief of its reality, and to be very much conversant with it in your thoughts. Thirdly, seek heaven only by Jesus Christ. Christ tells us that He is the way, He is the truth, and He is the life. He tells us that He is the door of the sheep. He states, I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved and go in and out and find pasture. If we therefore would improve our lives as a journey towards heaven, we must seek it by Him and not by our own righteousness, as expecting to obtain it only for His sake. Looking to Him and having our dependence on Him who has procured it for us by His merit, and expect that strength to walk in holiness, the way that leads to heaven, only from Him. And finally, this morning, as Christians and as a church, let us help one another in going this journey. There are many ways whereby Christians might greatly forward one another in their way to heaven. Therefore, let them be exhorted to go this journey as it were in company, conversing together and assisting one another. Company is always very desirable in a journey, but in none so much as this. Let them go united and not fall out by the way, which would be to hinder one another, but use all means that they can to help one another up the hill. This would ensure a more successful traveling and a much more joyful meeting at their Father's house in glory. So may we never let go of the thought that we are Christian pilgrims, and that the true Christian's life is a journey and a pilgrimage toward heaven. Let us pray. Lord, we have gathered this morning to bring you worship. For those of us who are followers of Christ, we rejoice in knowing that you have redeemed us, that you have saved us, that you, through the work of your Son, have set us apart unto yourself, and that you are working in us. And Lord, it is a much greater thought to know that our future is sure, and that we have a much better place than this world. I pray, Lord, for those who do not know you, that they may consider the road that they are traveling, and that by the power of your word and the working of your Spirit, you might draw them to yourself today, that there might be new people on this journey towards heaven. Lord, may all of our conversation and all of our thoughts be heavenly. May we long to have all of our practices in life be fit for being in your presence. And Lord, may we walk out of this place not only rejoicing in this truth and surety that we have, but may we proclaim the message of Christ and of salvation and of heaven to the world. And we ask all of this in Christ's name.